You're listening to The Justin Herman Show, where every episode he has conversations with interesting people. Here is your host, Justin Herman.
Hey everyone, welcome to The Justin Herman Show. This is going to be a really great episode. Brand new book from Eugene Cho, Thou Shall Not Be a Jerk. It's a guide for Christians engaging politics. And if you know me, you know that I love to talk about politics. I love to talk about politics on Twitter. I love to talk about it on Facebook. I love to talk about it with my friends. I love to talk about talk to great political people on the show. And talking to Eugene gave me a really great perspective that, to be honest, that I didn't have. I learned some stuff. It was really a great conversation. He's been lit up on Twitter lately. He called out President Trump for referring to the coronavirus as the Chinese virus, which is something I did on Twitter, and I got lit up for it. I actually had someone who follows me on Twitter emailed one of my sponsors to ask them to not only drop me and drop the podcast, but also to publicly come out against me as a racist. Very, very rarely do I get called a racist by an anonymous person emailing one of my sponsors, but yet it totally happened, and it really, really sad and kind of gross actually that someone would do that. But they did. But it was also unwise for me to just call it the Chinese virus. And Eugene helped me see some of that. So I actually learned something really valuable. He shared it through the lens of a story. I don't want to give the story away, but a story that when I heard it blew me away. You're going to love this conversation. It is timely. I'm posting it the day we recorded it. So if you're listening to it today, which is a Friday, then this is the day I recorded it. And it is current events. It is current discussion about coronavirus. It's current discussion about the impact that's having in the Asian community. It's current discussion about what Eugene is doing, not only professionally, but personally. And there's some great links in the show notes of things that he's involved with. So sit back, relax. If you're in California, you're locked in there for the next 30 days anyway, the Gavin Newsom's shelter-in-place order. So you have time to listen to podcasts. Listen to this one, catch up on some old ones, Matt Lewis and Jocko Willink and a bunch of great people. Relax. Take a deep breath. Just, don't breathe around people. Make sure there's a nice level of social distancing around people. But take a nice deep breath, relax, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with my new friend, Eugene Cho. Let's get to it. Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm joined by Eugene Cho. Eugene, how's it going, my friend?
We can be in better circumstances right now with the entire pandemic, but hanging in there.
You're here in California, correct? Or you're on the West Coast. You're not in California. I'm in California.
That's right. Yeah, I'm in the West Coast, but I'm in Seattle, Washington. And
Seattle's been hit really hard by the virus. So what's been the dynamic in Washington? Probably very different than some of our other states.
Yeah, it has been very challenging. I think it's often seen as the epicenter of the coronavirus here in the United States. Obviously, really hard, challenging things, but at the same time, you're also seeing beautiful glimpses of neighborliness, of fellow shared humanity. And so you're seeing a little bit of both. And so, despite the challenges, I've also really been encouraged.
Can you give a specific example? Because I think that there's a lot of people out there who maybe are dying to celebrate those glimpses with you. What's something you'd point to specifically and say, man, I saw this and it's exactly what's needed in this season, and maybe encourage people to do likewise?
Yeah, it might not sound really glamorous or sexy, but I think what I'm witnessing is people introducing themselves to their neighbors from a safe distance, like for the very first time or in a very long, long time. I think just seeing that is really encouraging. I've often said, just even from a theological perspective, that you can't love your neighbors if you don't even know your neighbors. And so I think what this has really caused is this understanding that we're actually in this together. The purpose of social distancing isn't just to care for yourself, but it's to care for others. From a theological perspective, the reason why churches should be engaged in social distancing is because that's what it means to be for the common good, to seek the peace of your city. So I've just been really encouraged by seeing neighbors say hi to us for the first time. We're trying to reach out to people both near and far to say, hey, we're all connected.
Yeah, I think this Easter, I'm excited to see what Easter looks like. I mean, I've been involved in the church for many, many years, decades, and I never experienced a season in the church like the one we're going through right now. So I'm excited to see what that looks like.
Well, I mean, I know this word has been used a few times, but these are unprecedented times. We have to give ourselves lots of room and grace because we've not navigated this. You don't take a class in Bible college or theological institutions or conferences how to navigate these sorts of things. But, it's a great reminder during difficult times, chaotic times, that the church is really never have been about a building. It's never about a production. And so like you, I'm seeing expressions of beautiful things of how the church is gathering together. And I'm also really intrigued how the capital C Church will respond during this global pandemic.
Yeah. Well, so you have a brand new book, Thou Shall Not Be a Jerk, A Christian's Guide to Engaging Politics. Now, I full disclosure, I'm more excited to talk to you about this book than probably any interview I've ever done. And that's no offense to our previous guests who have all been incredible. But maybe second to my excitement is my wife's excitement, because I like politics. I think politics is awesome. I like to engage in it, and she will she'll look at my Twitter or look at something I post, and she'll be like, "Oh, look how people are reacting. Maybe you shouldn't have said that. Maybe you should take that down." And I'm also highly aggressive, so I'm willing to get into it. I'm willing to get into spirited discussion on my point of view, and I'm willing to hear their point of view, and I'm willing to get into the whole thing. And sometimes it because I do it publicly. My wife hates that.
Sure.
So when I told her I was interviewing you and a little bit about the book, she's like, perfect. Listen to what this guy has to say. Let him help you set you straight. And I was reading through it, and I want to start here. So for coming from a guy that likes politics, likes being involved in politics, and likes talking about it, why do you think politics should matter to Christians? Christians like me, Christians out there, why should politics matter?
That's a great question, and I will say that there are some Christians that have taken the opposite perspective, that it's not spiritual and that Christians should only engage in spiritual things and therefore have absolutely disengaged with politics. I think there are some that are just overly exhausted because it feels toxic, and so they've disengaged. To both of those communities, I would say that while it's important to care for yourself, we need to engage it. I think as Christians, we're also called to be engaged in citizenship. We're called to be good citizens. We're called to be good neighbors. Politics is not the only expression of what it means to love your neighbor, but it's certainly one of the ways that we can do that. And I think politics, it sounds like a scary word, but I think politics, just generally speaking, speaks about governance, about how people live and engage and create kind of civic duty together. And so as a result, that's the reason why it matters. The last thing that I'll just say is that politics is also kind of a way for us to advocate, certainly for convictions and views, things that we believe embody the kingdom of God. But I think even in that more general description, it's an opportunity for us to advocate for those who are marginalized, for those who are hungry and poor, for those that might be oppressed. This is an avenue for us to engage our politics, our government, to speak up for those who do have a voice, but are often not heard in that process.
The question you pose, have you ever had a conversation or conversations with people who voted differently than you, I think is a really compelling question. I look at my own life, and I come from a pretty conservative worldview and perspective. I have friends who are super liberal, I love them. And we have a very, very different political points of view on almost every topic. But
Mm.
if they called me in the middle of the night and said they had a flat tire and they needed help changing it, I'd hop out of bed to help them. We have a deep friendship even though we have disagreement. Now, I think a lot of that friendship existed before a lot of the chaos of politics. Why is it so important for people who maybe don't have pre-existing friendships with people? They don't know the person, they just kind of know their politics, and then they shut that person off. Why is it so important to have conversations with people who vote differently than you or have a different point of view than you do?
Well, I mean, let's just bring it close to what's going on right now with
Sure.
the coronavirus, with COVID-19. I mean, can you imagine engaging only those that share in your politics, that you choose in response to COVID-19? You choose to only help those, to only listen to those, to only ask how others are doing based upon their political affiliation. And I think part of the toxicity of our political world right now is that we've identified who's with us and against us, who are allies and foes, and that we've made these broad stroke generalizations about other people. And I'm not suggesting that we can't have convictions and passions about what we believe in. I think there's a level of freedom that we should embrace. But when we're all together, cutting off any sort of relationship, it then reminds us or tells us that there isn't a shared humanity. This phrase that we're all in this together should be something that we remind ourselves post a COVID-19 pandemic, that we're all in this together. The other reason that I would say is because even though, if I'm honest, when it comes to like politics, probably like you, I have my convictions. So I think I'm right. That's my honest. I think I'm right. But I have to also acknowledge that I could be wrong, and that I can only maintain a particular perspective on something because of the lens that I bring. And so even though I may have some views about certain things, like a woman's perspective, an older person's perspective, a person of color's perspective, a person with a different perspective on human sexuality, it matters to help me better understand that it's not as singular, but it's a lot more nuanced, I think, than I want it to be. So those are some of the reasons why I think it's just so important for us to not just to really be intentional about pursuing friendships and conversations. As you said, that you be willing to go ahead and get out of bed and to help someone out. And it feels as if that we're living in a time, and it's not new, but it feels like we've been living in a time where our shared humanity is contingent on someone's political parallel to ours.
So I want to take a look at two groups of people and unpack a situation and get your perspective on it through the lens of your book. You've two people, both Christians. One is liberal, one is conservative. They walk into the room to have a conversation. One has a MAGA hat on, one has a Bernie t-shirt on. The conversation before it even starts ends because something like a MAGA hat is considered identifying with a hate-filled racist president, and so we can't even have a conversation because it's clear that you're a racist too. If you support him, then you must be all these other things too. And so before the conversation even starts, it ends because of preconceived ideas. How do you, if you walked into that room in the midst of that, how would you help unpack that situation and bring everyone back to the table to have a healthy conversation?
Sure. I think it first begins by a more honest question is, do you want to have a conversation? Because I want to be really realistic. There might be people that don't want to have a conversation altogether. And so, I wouldn't want to force something that a person or persons would not be interested in doing. But if they're interested in the conversation, if they're willing to listen and to also share, permission to speak, but permission to also an invitation to listen, then I think we can work with that. One of the things that I look upon Jesus as some of his most significant ministry, obviously he does miracles, he does incredible teachings, but I think it was his ability to gather people around the table. Like even the disciples themselves,
Yep.
sometimes we have this domesticated, kind of a sanitized version of these disciples. They were very different from one another, very different from one another. And somehow he was able to gather people, and often it was around shared table. It was around meals and conversation. So I'll answer your question, but one of the things that I write about in the book that I think is really important is that we've stopped eating together. We've stopped gathering around the table. A few years ago, after the last presidential election, there was a couple Asian American women in the Bay Area, I believe, who were just distraught by the results of the election, like half of the nation was. And as they were trying to process the results of the election and kind of their pain and trauma, they wanted to reach out to people within their community who voted the other way, who voted for President Trump. And they realized they didn't know a single person at all, that they had surrounded themselves only with people that thought like them. And so they sent out an invitation and said, would you be willing, if you voted for President Trump, would you be willing to gather around a dining table? We'll all bring food, safe space. We're not here to accuse or shout or be angry, but would you be willing to have a dialogue and conversation? And that began a vision for them called Make America Dinner Again.
Yeah, talk about that. Talk about that. Yeah. I love that idea.
And so what happened, what began as a simple meal really has spurred kind of a national and global movement of acknowledging the fact that as a nation, as people, we've actually just gathered around silos, echo chambers. And so I think there's something about gathering around the table with permission to say you can bring your full authentic self as long as you're willing to also listen to the other person as well. So going back to your original question, for me, it's just that question. Permission to say you can bring your full authentic self. You can bring your MAGA hat. You can bring your Bernie Sanders shirt. We can talk about why that hat or shirt might feel challenging or confrontational to the other person, but to also say we want to make sure that you're willing to listen to others as well.
When it comes, and I love that, by the way. And you're not. This isn't something that's just kind of a theoretical idea. You've seen and been part of dinners like this. It's not just a catchy thing you're saying. Like you've seen this play out successfully.
Yeah, I mean, I joined my local MARA thing as well. But for me, whether it's as a pastor, as a citizen, for me, it's all the same. I think it's just really important for us to acknowledge that you can't really be a good neighbor if you're not treating others the way that you want to be treated. If you're broad stereotypes and generalizations on others, if you're not willing to listen during this time, obviously, I think everybody feels a little hurt or afraid or ignored. And so I think it's an important time for us that as we're willing to share some of our thoughts and views, that we're also committed to the art of listening.
So for someone who, and again, these aren't made up situations. These are real situations that I've either read about or have seen myself, where someone would say, but Eugene, something like I want to listen, but there's some things that are just too hateful to be heard. There's some things, there's some speech that is just, even though I want to listen, there are some things that aren't worth being heard because it is hate speech, it is wrong, and so we need to just reject that and shut that down. What would be your response to that person?
Yeah, I think anytime someone is suggesting anything that's actually causing physical harm that contributes to the harm of other people, I think there are limits, there are boundaries in which we have to operate. So I fully acknowledge that. But again, I would just say, while we should be clear about speaking against certain things, when we're speaking about racism, when we're speaking about some sort of whatever the issue might be, I think we should be very clear and very passionate about acknowledging that it's harmful, that it's contributing to physical danger to people. But I'm not a fan of shutting down conversations or thoughts. And I do think that there are lots of people in the middle. Like sometimes we allow political rhetoric to be dominated by kind of the extremist conversations on both ends.
Give an
Maybe
example. Give an example of that. Like what you'd put in that category.
Well, I mean, I think sometimes it's the political pundits that, I don't want to mention names.
No, of course
per
not.
se,
Of course not.
but I don't want, for example, Christianity to be only relegated to the handful of spokespeople that the media goes to on a regular basis. Again, I don't need to mention names here, but I just feel like sometimes, if we're just going to just a handful of people and they represent all of Christianity, or certainly all of evangelical Christianity, I think there are a lot of people in the middle, a lot of people. And by middle, I'm not talking about necessarily geographically or politically, but a lot of folks who are trying to bumble and stumble their way through the question of what does it mean to be faithful Christians with integrity, navigating through the messy, complex nuances of life and politics. And so for me, when I say we need time to listen and have conversations, there's a lot of room somewhere around there to have conversations with people that are trying the best that they can, but are confused and at times lost and scared because they feel like this is so messy and I feel so alone.
So traditionally, you have not been known for being overly political, but obviously you wrote this book. Do you think this raised your influence, or do you feel like you put a little bit of influence on the table, like you risked losing some influence with this book?
Both. Both. I've received my share of criticism anytime I engage political issues or what people consider to be political. Just this past week, I responded to as respectfully as I could to a tweet by President Trump referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus. I responded to that. It led to an interview with Washington Post, which got picked up by about 25 plus newspapers around the world, which has resulted in probably about 20,000 comments and responses, both in newspaper publications, on Twitter and Facebook, and most of it being pretty hateful, I would say. Pretty challenging. So there's a cost, and I acknowledge that. But I think, again, it's important for us to model both speaking with a level of civility, but also speaking the best that we can, not to be afraid to share our thoughts in the public arena. And you're right. I'm not necessarily known. I'm not a political expert or a political pundit, but I have always cared about, yes, my neighbor. I've always cared about living out my faith. Some people might call it political, some people might not, but I've always cared about those things. And in my new chapter, not chapter as in book, but in a few months, I'll be starting my new role as the president and CEO of an advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. called Bread for the World.
Oh, wow.
And what we do there is, we're engaging the halls of power. We're engaging senators and House of Representatives. We're engaging political leaders using the voice of the capital C Church to advocate for the poor, the hungry, the vulnerable in our country and around the world. And it's really, really messy. This past week, since COVID-19, man, we have been working around the clock. Again, as people are talking about how the government can come alongside America and fellow Americans, which we agree with. And at the same time, we're also saying, let's not forget those whose families and children are relying on free and reduced lunch programs at school. How do we advocate for those who are incarcerated, that they have access to free hygiene, free phone calls, and the list goes on and on.
So yesterday, knowing that I was going to have you on the podcast today, which I'm so honored, by the way, I don't know if I've said that yet. Thank you for making all this time. I put out a tweet very similar. So first of all, I saw President Trump's tweet. I saw your tweet. I saw the reaction from it, and being somewhat of a snarky, just being myself. And knowing I was going to have you on the podcast today, I thought, I wonder what the reaction would be for me. So I posted something about and referring to it as the Chinese virus as well. And within 15 minutes, one of my podcast sponsors emailed me and said that they got an email from someone that said I was making racist comments on Twitter and that they should cancel their sponsorship with me and they should come out publicly against me. Now, I've been on Twitter for years, and I've said, I've talked about a whole lot of topics over that time. That's never happened. That cancel culture, let's go after how they make their money, call them a racist. That's never happened to me, but now it finally has. And I took it down because my wife was in my ear about it, and she said, just talk to Eugene about it tomorrow. Take it off Twitter now. Talk to Eugene about it tomorrow. So why do you think, and again, it in a time like this, which I would compare to a 9/11-esque type, everybody is suffering, this is a time for us to kind of come together. There's still these massive chasms that keep people apart. And, in this case, language that was used that was insensitive or inappropriate or whatever word you want to use to it is one of those things that creates more of a chasm. Again, why is the reaction to that so visceral, so real for people? And for Trump, who doesn't listen to the podcast, but he's always welcome to listen and come on as a guest, obviously. And for anyone else who'd say, well, it's a Chinese virus. It's just like the Spanish flu or the West Nile virus, like it's named after the place that it's from. For everyone who has that opinion, obviously it is very visceral to a large segment of our society that responds completely differently. Help unpack even just that with us real quick so that we can understand.
Sure. Well, it's complicated, and I'll do my best in limited time to try to unpack it.
Sure.
So what I would say is this. I'd begin by acknowledging the fear and pain that so many people are in. This is impacting all of us. It's impacting every single aspect of our lives. So I want to just start there. And when people are in pain or when they're hurting, I think we want to then ask the question, why and who is to blame? And when I look at this situation, it has never been debated that it originated in Wuhan, China. And for months, in the beginning, I do know that media, they were referring to it as the Wuhan virus. But I think as it began to hit really mainstream, it was clearly identified as COVID-19. It was identified as the coronavirus and has been identified by the World Health Organization. And almost every organization has been referring to it as COVID-19. I know that there's also some propaganda that has been started in the Communist Party in China that's ridiculous. And I want to acknowledge that, hey, we should be clear that they should be held accountable, that they should have notified the global community about this as early as possible. So I want to acknowledge all of those things. Now, in the midst of this, what I've appreciated through our government is, despite some early stumbles, is that they've tried to really explain the severity of COVID-19 to the American people. I've been listening in to most of the daily updates that the coronavirus task force has been giving. And I've just appreciated the depth, the nuance, explaining these things. And I think what's been problematic to me is that by calling it now the Chinese virus, which is not the term that others have been using, I think it would have been fair to say, hey, there's propaganda that's been given that somehow the Communist Party, they're now suggesting that it's originated from the United States. We want to make it very absolutely clear that that's not the case, that they should be held accountable. But I think now by calling it the Chinese virus, what we're doing is we're adding to a lot of hurt and pain that already exists in America and around the global context. And now we're not just attributing it to the Chinese government, but there's like this messy space that anyone who's of Chinese descent, and if I can just think more broadly, the reality is not everyone understands. Like for me, it's not just Chinese descent, it's people that look Asian.
Yeah.
Even prior to this, I don't think people know how much harassment verbal abuse, and even physical assaults have taken place to those people of Asian descent, not just in this country, but around the world. Just yesterday, 2 stories, 2 cousins, 2 family members of people being physically abused in public spaces, sweared at, harassed, told to get out of their stores. Like, this is happening right now. And I know that the majority of your listeners probably won't know this name, but for Asian Americans, the name Vincent Chin is incredibly important because it marks a significant part of Asian American history. And he's significant because he was a Chinese person who was beaten to death during the whole economic implosion of the auto industry. I believe this happened in Detroit. And he was beaten to death because people mistook him for being a Japanese person, beaten at a bar, and those who were responsible for beating him to death were exonerated and not incarcerated at all. And the reason why I think I'm concerned about this kind of rhetoric is we're just at the beginning of this pandemic. Who knows what's going to happen?
Yeah.
And so when Asian Americans are experiencing verbal assault, physical abuse, we need leadership. We need churches, pastors, theologians. We need the average citizen. And we need the government that, as they speak about the complexities of their situation with the Chinese government, to also acknowledge, hey, and in the midst of this, we want you to know that our fellow citizens, our fellow Americans, like some of the comments that I've gotten on Twitter is, you're not American. You're communist, you're Chinese, you'll never be one of us, go back home.
Ugh.
And I can't tell you how painful that is. I'm now nearly 50 years old. I feel like I've contributed a little bit of good to this country. I'm a proud American citizen. And I think to some that no matter what, I will always be an outsider, a foreigner. And maybe this is being a little dramatic, but in essence, I'm a Chinese virus. And so, yeah, it's incredibly problematic, and it's dangerous. And I am afraid to wake up one morning to the news that someone will not just be verbally assaulted, but even have another Vincent Chin situation in our hands as well.
When you're talking and I'm taking in what you're saying, it is slowly, it's changing my perspective, obviously. Not every interaction is an argument to be won, which sometimes is the perspective I have. And I love what you're sharing, and I love what you're saying. And I did not know about Vincent Chin. I've never heard that story before until right now. And that grieves me. And there's probably people out there who still, in their grossness, would say all the gross things they said to you on Twitter, and I hate that. But not everyone is that. And the hard thing is getting painted with that same brush, and it's vice versa. I think that conservatives would paint liberals with the same brush. You take the most extreme elements of that and then paint the whole group that way. And it obviously happens on the other side as well. How do you cut through that? And I think you've given some examples in your book, of course, but how do you cut through the being painted the same as everyone else when you're not, when you don't have, that is evil to me. Saying to someone on Twitter, you're not one of us, go back to where you came from. That's gross. And I hate that. I think it's disgusting. But because I'm a conservative, then I must hold that same view that crazy person has because we voted the same way. How do you cut through that in order to get to health with your neighbor?
Yeah, I think sometimes these labels about conservative, liberal, progressive, Republican, Democrat, this is when I think it's really not helpful.
Yeah.
I think we could have our views. When people ask me, Eugene, are you a Republican or Democrat? My honest response is, on what? What are we talking about?
Mm-hmm.
As if to say that one word, one label, one party is able to fully encapsulate my views, which aren't always static, but they're dynamic. We're constantly evolving and changing as well. And so, yeah, I think you're right that we have to be careful about these broad stereotypes and generalizations. I have been hammered by some of my friends on the left that have responded to me saying that I'm not going to swear off all 62 million people that voted for president. I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to paint a broad stroke on every single person, that I understand their motives. And on the flip end, I'm not going to paint that kind of a stroke on those who voted for Hillary in the last presidential election. I can't always be responsible for how other people respond. Going to your question, if I could, I would love for them to have an epiphany, a change, a transformation. And I think that's part of the challenge, right? Is that I can't always control. In fact, I will never be able to control how other people respond. I think what I can do, and the purpose of my book is, I don't want to necessarily back down from my views and thoughts and convictions, but I also don't want to be a jerk. I think it's not just the what we convey, but it's also the how that we convey as well. And so when I'm thinking about the comments that I'm reading, and I have not read all of them because it just would not be good for my soul.
Yeah, don't do that.
But when I think about reading some of them, I think to myself, hey, why do we talk like this? When did we start talking like this? And I know we can talk about the anonymity of the internet and so forth, but I mean, there's this poison, there's this toxicity that has taken seed within us. And as naive as it might be, one by one, little by little, we have to just keep having these conversations. And so for me, it's a commitment rooted in my faith as a follower of Jesus, that I'm going to respond to people not with hate, not with vile, not with violence, not with bigotry, but I want to respond, yes, with courage, and yes, at times with deep passion. I'm not going to compromise some of the convictions that I have. I want to listen, but I also want to engage with the level of civility. I want to be a person of peace. I want to be a person of hope. I want to be a person of love. And again, so not everyone will respond to that, and that's okay, because I had to receive and accept the fact I can't control how others will respond.
Sometimes it's tempting to be the loudest, the angriest, the first person to speak, the person to have the final word. Why do we need to resist that urge? And I think maybe even more specifically, more directly, have you ever had a moment where you've wanted to take to Twitter to something and you put your phone down? You're like, I'm not going to do it. It's not worth it. For me, I struggle with that. I've never met a discussion on Twitter that I haven't wanted to give my opinion into. I've never met a news story that I haven't wanted to throw out a comment to. And sometimes I'm like, I should have just put my phone down. I should have just turned the Twitter app off and just gone to bed. What is it about us that sometimes we are so tempted to fall into those loudest, last to speak categories? And what should we be doing differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you've identified that this is part of the culture that we live in. It's the waters in which we swim. Another way to put it is, it feels as if the currency of our culture is fear-mongering. It's loudness and brashness. It's what gets the most clicks. It's what gets the biggest audience. Mm-hmm. And that adds to money for advertisers, perhaps. It adds to a bigger audience. The more sensational, the more outrageous that we are. You think about some of the talk show radios. I mean, it's pretty crazy. It's over the top, but that's the currency. It's because there's an audience for it. So in some sense, as a shared population, we're kind of adding to that problem. And when you ask the question, have I ever been in that situation? Of course, I'm human, and I also swim in these waters. In the book, I painfully confess one of my biggest, it was a huge mistake. And without really absorbing the news, because things are moving so quickly, the news cycle moves so quickly. So there are times without absorbing things, processing things, thinking about things, I'll want to contribute to it because I want to, be someone that speaks about injustice or wrong or whatever it might be. And, one of the stories that I confess about is the situation with a young gentleman by the name of Nick Standman. He was the one that was wearing a red MAGA hat
Yeah.
in Washington, D.C., having this engagement with a Native American elder named Nathan Phillips. I'm sure many of your listeners have at least some knowledge of that. But, when I saw that, I just saw the image of them standing shoulder to shoulder, staring at each other. And I thought, man, the smugness look on this young man's face, clearly this was unjust and wrong and harmful and all of that. And without actually reading through and processing it and filtering, is this news accurate and real and honest? I wrote something on my Facebook and Twitter, and it kind of blew up. It spread, was shared, retweeted, all of these things. And then the more I learned and read about what was going on, I realized I didn't fully understand the story. And so I had to write an apology, which, I don't like writing apologies because you're confessing that you're wrong. You made a mistake and you're wearing humble pie on your face. And even the apology, I was shocked by the number of people who were upset that I was writing an apology because I was harming the cause of justice and what have you. And so, yeah, I've been in that situation. I think it's a reminder for us that we don't need to win the internet every time. We don't need to engage every single conversation, that there's actually wisdom sometimes in silence, that I think even though things are moving so quickly, that it might be wise for us to breathe, to pause, to absorb news. And it's something that we have to really name as a dangerous thing in our culture.
When it comes to because you're kind of fake news, I'd love to touch on that briefly before we wrap up. How should Christians, what should Christians do about fake news? It seems like it's everywhere and the word is thrown around. How should Christians respond to that?
I think I would maybe take a step back. The term fake news was actually used even before this current administration. It's been used before. It's become popularized during this current administration. And I think we can actually acknowledge that there is fake news, but maybe even to step back, I think news has shifted and changed over the years. And what used to be just a simple replaying of details to people, what's happened in today's world, and this is everywhere, is that what's happened, particularly in cable news, is that we're not just giving news, but we're giving commentary on that news. And so as a result, commentary comes in with lenses and biases and particular inclinations towards certain things. So when you watch Fox News or CNN, you're not just getting data, you're getting commentary on those details. So I think we have to just kind of understand what news looks like. And so as a result, we can't just lock ourselves into one particular news source. So for myself, I, like to read not just multiple news, but I also like to read news outside the U.S. context as well, because I want to be more informed. I think it was Karl Barth who said that, what it means to be faithful citizens, faithful followers of Jesus, is that you have a Bible in one hand and a newspaper on the other hand. So that's kind of the posture that I want to engage, to be people that are good citizens of our nation, but also more importantly, faithful followers of Jesus.
You're moving. So are you moving to DC with this new job?
Soon. I'll be commuting for 1 year because I have a son that's graduating from high school next year.
That's awesome.
And then moving to DC, sometime next year.
DC's incredible. I think you're going to love DC. Obviously, you've been there.
See.
Obviously, you've been there.
I have, but, I think everyone tells me that, DC just has a very particular culture. And, I would just encourage folks that might be listening to this. I'm running two organizations. One's called One Day's Wages. Would love for folks to check out onedayswages.org. We'll be starting a COVID-19 emergency crisis fund to help those that are living in the most vulnerable communities around the world. And then certainly would love for folks to check out Bread. You can learn more about us at bread.org, because we really want to encourage Christians to exercise their voice, to hold our elected leaders accountable, to particularly care for the hungry and vulnerable in our nation and around the world.
I love that. We're going to put links to both of those in the show notes. And your book is out now. People can go get it on Amazon, everywhere else they sell books.
Absolutely.
It's going to be great. Eugene, thank you so much for spending time with us on the show today. You are a great leader, thinker, pastor, and influencer, and it was truly a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much, brother. Blessings to you.
Blessings to you.